Okay, well, I think that's maybe a good time to open up the debate to the floor. I want it to carry on being a conversation, really, so I'm going to ask someone to kick us off. And Alice, I saw your hand go up first. So let's have a question here.
Oh, actually, is that on? That's fine. I'm loud enough. Okay. So I was actually thinking that you've all talked about your particular studies, and I maybe wanted to make a meta point, trying to highlight a commonality between them. And I wonder if the common theme here is incentives and expectations to contribute to public goods. So, for example, in the case of China, we see how bureaucrats, because of the McDonald's scheme, were incentivized to get growth for their local areas. So incentives were working that way, in a top-down way, working for the public good. Likewise, in Cambodia and in your book, we highlight how business associations, when they get strong, can force the government to build more effective governance in Cambodia. So you've got the one-stop shop, was a great quote in your chapter. So it's when these institutions evolve in a co-evolutionary, mutually reinforcing process, the business associations get stronger, then they can have a bigger voice, then the government informs the rules, then they're building stronger public goods. Likewise, in Sierra Leone, when you've got another incentive structure, which is people having information about how good the services are doing, then the politicians have an incentive to improve their services, otherwise they get out. So I don't think we need to worry about whether it's democracy or whether it's authoritarianism or whether it's business associations in particular. What we need to understand is that it's incentives and expectations drive people to work towards public goods. So what we need to do in any context is think about, well, what's working, what could work in that context, and let's strengthen those incentives. And my only addition to what is obviously brilliant is to think, well, let's not just focus on the domestic incentives. Obviously, there's so much that we can do in Britain to get the international incentives right, whether it's in terms of global supply chains in Cambodia, Bangladesh, environmental incentives, so that people see it as there's an international incentive to get governance right and work for pro-poor experimentation. Sorry, just a common thread there. Thank you.
Panel, any responses to that point?
You wouldn't get an argument from an economist that incentives matter.
Yes, in the public goods, we need more incentives for public goods.
And I think in the audience, if you have a point that's kind of directly related to that point, you can put sort of two fingers up like this, and I can try. Okay, but from the back here, then let's have a response to that.
I'm fascinated by your presentation. I'd like to read your.
Have you got your mic on actually?
Thank you. Does that work? Yes. Peter Newborn, Research Associate, ODI. I'd like to ask Yen, your presentation was very interesting. I haven't read the book, but when you talk about 50 million bureaucrats, I mean, what does that word bureaucrat mean? I mean, are these in fact political leaders in your system? And so my question, to get a commonality and learn from the Chinese experience, is what is the equivalent in other countries? Because these are people who've managed to use this sort of incentive system to sort of foster economic activity and growth. But they're not what we would think of bureaucrats or civil servants in many other contexts, who in some countries, I have the impression, just write plans, more than perhaps in China, and do have a different function and are not political leaders. So can you comment on that? Because they're almost like entrepreneurs, CEOs of provincial sort of public companies, if you see what I mean.
Could I clarify?
Yes, please.
So very good question. Just to clarify on that point. So when I say the party-state bureaucracy, 50 million, I'm referring to people who work in the public administration. Yeah. So including party organs and administrative offices, everything from police, economic planning, and so forth. This excludes the military, excludes state-owned enterprises and universities. If you bring that in, the bureaucracy would be even larger. So when I say the administration, 50 million people working in it, 20% have the formal status of a civil servant. And these people tend to be in more planning sort of roles, and the rest of them are the street level implementers. And in the 20% of the civil servants, 1% would be the leadership. So this is roughly, so it's a very big pyramid, basically.
So what's the
in China.
equivalent in other countries?
What's the equivalent? Well, in other countries, you have the public administration, right? And then you have the leadership. The difference is that the leadership in democracies are elected by the people. But in China, the bureaucracy is not elected by the people, right? And and they're all appointed top down. So that's how I would think about the equivalent. Yeah. Yeah. And could I get back to Alice's point, or should
Yes,
we open
sure,
it up?
sure.
Yeah. So Alice's great question. I would meta your question, which is, I think the broader issue that you've raised, not only incentives, but I think the broader theme here is that I think good principles can manifest in numerous ways. So I actually completely agree with Rachel's point that voice and accountability are absolutely necessary for economic growth, and China is the best example of that. And I am comfortable saying this in Beijing. I think the Chinese policymakers would agree with me because they themselves are the beneficiary of having a greater voice and clearer accountability since market reforms began. Yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about that? Because some people will be I think some people will be surprised by that statement. So maybe you can put some flesh on the bones of that.
I think when we say voice and accountability, we immediately think democracy, right? So we think elections, we think about like town councils having citizens come. So we think about democratic institutions. But I think we need to understand that even in a single party dictatorship, you can introduce voice and accountability, which is necessary for economic growth. And that's exactly what we see in China. So once they had market reforms, they gave the bureaucrats a lot more voice. They can debate. Under Mao, you couldn't. If you criticize him, you'll be persecuted. But when Deng came to power, he actively encouraged debate within the bureaucracy. And when you have a very big bureaucracy, that's still a lot of debate. You don't necessarily have to have 1 billion people participate.
Okay, well, I mean, I think this is an appropriate time to bring in a question from our online audience. Nikolai Schultz asks, why was it that the Chinese central government was so committed to growth? Were there particular pressures on it that were driving that?
I think when we talk about the Chinese leadership, we need to distinguish between different leadership administrations because they had several changes in leadership.
Well, let's start with Deng Xiaoping.
Right,
then.
with Deng Xiaoping, his goal was actually much simpler, which was putting food on the table. So he didn't actually think about, we're going to become a market economy. He had he did not think about that. And therefore, in the 1980s, the goal was the theme was called crossing the river by touching the stones, meaning they had no idea what's going to be across the river. Just put food on people's table.
I mean, is it fear that the leadership are going to be overthrown in a popular uprising because
I don't think
people?
so. I think it was just the imperative because the country at the time was in shambles. Right? Remember, massive starvation during the Great Leap Forward, widespread poverty, chaos of the Cultural Revolution. He was just really trying to keep things together.
Okay.
So in a sense, it was a modest goal, but with such a big country, I guess that's not really a modest goal. But he didn't have a clear vision of what, that we were going to have a market transition. But in the 1990s, leadership had a very clear vision that, we are going to build a market economy, but with the CCP in power. And so I think when we talk about the Chinese leadership, we really need to make a very sharp distinction between different Chinese leaderships.
Okay, great. And a follow-up question to that, again from Nikolai, is, we've talked a lot about incentives. We've talked about the carrots that the kind of local level bureaucrats received to bring in investment. But were there any sticks? How did the top leadership, in what other ways did they direct this investment drive?
There were sticks. Sometimes they were just really pretty brute stakes, as in the investment program that I described, if you succeed, you get to keep a share of it, just commission system. And in some cases, if you actually underperform, your agency has to pay a fine, a penalty for underperforming.
Right.
The agency operates like a like basically a corporation within a franchise. So you will be rewarded and penalized for your performance.
And the central authorities really have the power to enforce that.
When we say the central authority, I need to qualify that because Beijing never told them to do this.
Okay.
The localities came up with it themselves.
Okay, great. The man in the light blue shirt with the beard, I saw your hand go up first.
Thank you very much, Marcus Manuel, also from the Overseas Development Institute. Two questions. One, just to pick up where we are on the China issue. I mean, one of the issues clearly was you inherited 1,000 years of bureaucracy, and you inherited a competitive process to getting into that. And people have said, well, that's actually part of the whole East Asian mystery miracle. I just wonder if you want to comment on that. I mean, you had a competitive bureaucracy. Was that part of the process, so you coming into it? And then to take it back to the Africa, let's talk about Uganda, to bring in another country where you've seen very strong developmental leadership from Museveni in the 80s and 90s. He then discovered the value of selling votes by free education and free health. There was some responsiveness about delivery. And then he discovered that you can actually keep control by just being very corrupt and taking all the money out. Let's characterize. But I'd be interested to, we talk a lot about China. Can we talk about another context as well and how all these arguments play out? Thank you.
Well, you went first. I suppose that should go to you. Let's respond to that.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's a question that many people ask about this, this Confucian bureaucracy, and the Chinese government themselves like to promote that. I myself am not a big fan of that argument. I think it tends to be construed as, China had a Confucian bureaucracy, and therefore, it's like a success is a foregone conclusion. It was easy for them to do that. I think it's some facts to bear in mind is that they had about a 30-year period under Mao where it was not a meritocracy. Mao specifically hated technocrats. He did not like intellectuals. Right? He had several campaigns where he basically, found out who's the intellectual, who are the people criticizing him, and put them all in jail. He already stripped the country of the educated people. And so for 30 years, you're talking about a bureaucracy that was lacking educated, technocratic people. And so the amazing thing, once you put that in context, is that when market reforms started, they had to start with a bureaucracy that was not a technocracy, that was really lacking in highly educated, technocratic people, which they then subsequently, within a very short amount of time, build up once markets open.
Okay, thank you very much. And Kunal, there's a Uganda chapter in the Deals and Development book. Does that shed any light on this question about Museveni's changing strategies for staying in power?
I mean, Uganda, as you and Tim, you yourself have done some work on Uganda as part of a project on health, as part of the Effective States Development Research Center's work, and I think you can also talk on that if you had to.
Plugging that.
But the point here is that there was a shift in the Ugandan political settlement from a strong dominant party settlement in Museveni in the early years to a weak dominant party settlement where patronage-based mechanisms became more important, not just on growth, of course, but also on other around delivery of public goods and so on. So it was very to do with the change in political settlement that happened in Uganda that manifested itself in many different ways, which I think perhaps in the Chinese case is not so obvious. I mean, in China, it could be fair to say it's still a strong dominant party settlement. Not one leader, but definitely much more. Exactly, like a Singaporean. So I think there are differences in the settlements, evolution of settlements over time, and why that happens. That's something that's much more difficult to explain. But certainly the nature of the settlement in Uganda was very different and changed over time, and that might explain the differences.
I think one answer from within the framework is that over time, within Uganda, you see lower level factions within Museveni's party becoming stronger, and that actually reduces the ability of the top leadership to kind of plan long-term for development and make kind of effective, long-horizon, strategic interventions, and instead throws the emphasis onto kind of vote buying, crony capitalism, and so on and so forth. Dirk?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the range of issues, which is around sort of the accountability and civil service. I suppose so accountability has different levels of accountability, but one is in this context also sort of mutual accountability between the public and the private sector, at a lower level. So at a lower level, and can bureaucrats, can they actually do something helpful for the private sector to actually solve their problems? And I suppose that's where we get different expectations, different views, even in across African countries, of course, where investors really like the idea that the Ethiopian Investment Promotion Agency has officials in them that are specifically dedicated to their investment, for example, and to solve problems. In the case of Rwanda, you might also have something like that, perhaps a bit less so. But if you go to another country with a big letter T on the coast, then you don't see the same level of help from the civil servants for the private sector. And whilst the plan of the country is is to look in terms of industrialization, it is there to think around priority actions. There is something around, for example, special economic zone building in a country, but then the civil servants don't actually then follow that up, and so you don't necessarily get the mutual accountability between the public sector officials and the private sector, and that there's not that understanding of working together. And I think that's what I really learned from at least the Chinese case, where there's a lot of working together, adjusting, and so on. And you get that in a lot of other Asian countries, at least from my understanding of it. But we're really hoping that is going to take place also in African countries, or at least much more so, and that we had sort of 30, 40 years ago where the state was owning the private sector. They owned the productive capabilities. Then they completely withdrew for various reasons from production. But there's, of course, there's now more. We need something in between that actually the private sector, the public sector, can do something positive. Of course, you need to get the incentives right for the private sector to act well, but there's something complementary. You need to provide also signals. You need to think about fostering clustering, for example. It isn't just about getting the incentives right for the private sector. It's doing more, and having the incentive in the public sector to do that is an important question. And actually going more towards the co-evolution model in China, how you do that will be quite an interesting challenge, how you do that gradually, I think.
I mean, we have talked a lot about incentives, and Alice made this sort of meta point that it was all about incentives, but there is a sort of subplot in these works about the importance of ideas, and that kind of changing the receptiveness of the bureaucracy to ideas about growth, to ideas about economic policy, can be kind of equally important in causing these growth accelerations. I mean, I think we saw that in India, which in some ways doesn't fit the other cases in terms of the political arrangements it had in place when its growth acceleration started. Nevertheless, it was kind of a shift from a socialist to a pro-market ideology, which was sufficient really to stimulate quite a lot of investment.
Absolutely. I mean, the one thing I should say, and I didn't, sorry, I should have mentioned this earlier about Ewan's book, but what I find quite remarkable in the book is that this debate about what are called second-best institutions, the Roderick kind of terminology, and the good enough governance debate, I kind of felt I had moved into a kind of place where I don't think it was moving very much, where there would be this view that it's kind of a normative view. The second best is okay for Africa, but first best is okay for Denmark or Sweden or whatever. What Ewan argues is that what China did was first best. That's remarkable. So in other words, in that context, when you have weak institutions, formal institutions, and weak human capital and weak technological capabilities, what you do is you try and build markets, and that's a first best strategy. That's not a second best strategy. And I think that really changed the parameters, the way we think about this question about good enough governance versus good governance, first best versus second best institutional reform, because I think once we move into this very murky area of second best, we do get normative issues that why second best?
Why should we have the second best?
Exactly, and I think that's a valid question.
Yeah.
But if you see this as a first best strategy that you do and those sorts of conditions, and then as you with co-evolution you move to some other kind of strategy when you can move to more kind of good governance, then you can see that in each context you have to have particular strategies which are first, best, optimal in that context. And I think that's a game changer in my view, because that's something that we hadn't thought about in this way.
I agree. That's another very kind of interesting part of your book, Yuan. Okay, something else from the audience? Yes, here.
Hello, Kate Bird, ODI. Just to see if I can prompt the panel to take the discussion in a slightly different direction. I've found the discussion so far really fascinating, but what I feel is missing from the debate is any discussion about differentiation within populations. And I'd like to hear if there are lessons from your analysis for how the very poorest people can be engaged in growth processes on good terms, so in markets, including in jobs markets and in enterprise of every kind. Thank you very much.
Can I add to that, please? Because I think the issue of spatial, Stephen Gelb, also from ODI, spatial inequality needs to be taken into account. And I'd be interested to know how either of these two models, which are somewhat complementary perhaps, look at that. Because in China and in India, actually, and I'd be interested to hear Kunal talk a bit more about how India fits this model or not. But in both China and India, Nigeria, and other countries that's been mentioned, you've got massive spatial inequalities which have gotten worse as growth has happened in the national economy. And I think that picks up on, in important ways, on what Kate's talking about.
Okay, well, perhaps we can have one or two more questions on this theme of inequality, distribution, poverty, directly related. Yes, at the back.
I cheated. Is that on? Is that on? Okay, I cheated. It's not really directly related, but I'm not sure I'm going to get my question in otherwise.
Away from her.
My name's Liz May, and I work at Tradecraft. I just wanted to observe that the conversation so far seems to kind of assume that we're in some kind of international political vacuum where what happens at the national level can be directed with some kind of degree of autonomy. And I think we need to recognise that for a lot of countries, the needs of donors, the needs of investors, the needs of international NGOs, the constraints placed on them by trade agreements, etc., massively constrain the ability for them to pursue different policy choices. And so it seems for me that for China, that was perhaps less of a constraint, but for many other countries, they don't have that freedom to single-mindedly pursue the strategy that they've decided on, because there are so many other competing factors and forces that they're having to respond to. And I would just be interested what the panel think about that.
Okay, well, that's a slightly different point. But let's start with these points about inequality.
Well, I want to pick up on the spatial one, because I think that's really important. I do a lot of work in Bangladesh and Sierra Leone. And, you know, just from the minute you walk off the plane, you are struck by the spatial differences here. Like, one is incredibly, has high concentration of labour to land, and the other is incredibly dispersed. Right? And when I hear about these general discussions about how do you get growth and how do you get Africa to be like East Asia, I'm like, can we stop and just think about the fact that, in Bangladesh there is this massive pool of labour that you can pull into manufacturing, and you want to get anywhere in Sierra Leone, and the people want to get anywhere. It's really expensive. You've just got to think about these things differently. If we're not thinking about spatial differences, there's no way we can be getting it right, because it's just so fundamentally different. And I think, and one of my predecessors in this job of chief economist sort of made this point about land-labor ratios in Africa, and maybe it's looking more like a Latin America. And so I just, I think we do need to think about these differences when we talk about possible routes to growth. And if we're not factoring in, people talked about investment in infrastructure in Africa. Well, again, if there's very few people per mile of road, it's going to be a really different investment payoff there than in Bangladesh, where, I can't tell the difference between, I randomize by village, you can't tell where one stops and the other starts. I mean, it's just people. whereas I've got lovely, 5 miles between my villages in Sierra Leone. And it's really fundamental. In terms of, I also just wanted to come back on the point about Uganda and kind of which linked to, shouldn't you be taking into account the long-term history of China and in that influence? There is a lot of evidence that these long-term historical patterns do have then these persistent effects, and which does bring back that accountability and voice can have important effects on long-term economic outcomes. So within Sierra Leone, just to stick there again, people have found that contestability in the amongst the chiefs, way back, how many sons there were in the chiefs in different parts of Sierra Leone when the British came, now still has an effect now. Why? Because you have these different families who could then compete against each other for control in an area, versus if there was only one son, then there's only one lineage, and therefore there's no contestability. So you just get these, long-term impacts. And so, yes, we may have lost the bureaucracy for 30 years, but the fact that it was there, I think, is very, very different from a situation where all the decisions were being made by these chiefs it was all hereditary, and and we see that playing out now in economic impacts. Now, what the contestability was, a century ago.
So we're getting into a question of sort of long-term path dependence, but maybe Yuan, I can bring you back to this sort of spatial inequality point, because I wonder whether you're also talking about inequalities within countries.
So maybe I could address the inequality and poverty issues with sort of 3 quick comments. The first is about how China reduced poverty using a sequence of approaches, right? So I just said that they had lifted 700 million people out of poverty, not using poverty programs, but simply through market liberalization and national development. Then in 2012, then Xi Jinping came in, and then he started to have very, very aggressive anti-poverty targeted at particular households and community. So the good news is, no, anti-poverty programs are still completely relevant. But in China's context, what they did is first you just kickstart the economy, and they reduce poverty in the first 35 years by raising average income, creating jobs. But at the same time, because there was no redistribution in place, it created a tremendous income inequality in China. So by 2012, in terms of the Gini coefficient, China was more unequal than the US. And so that is why in 2012, when Xi Jinping came to office, he decided that one of his key mandates is to have a very aggressive scheme of anti-poverty programs. So it happened in sequence.
But nevertheless, I mean, Deng Xiaoping, I think he says it's okay for some people to get rich before.
That was his entire philosophy.
Yeah.
It was not about redistributing money to the poor. He was like, let's open the markets, let's have free competition, and if you're competent, you get rich. That's fine.
Whereas now, in the world of the SDGs and this doctrine of leave no one behind, there's an idea that the SDGs will not be achieved unless they're achieved equally for all segments of society. So that's kind of very different to the Chinese approach, right? Dirk?
I mean, I think also, I think we should also mention, and can also your approach in this, which is really important, because making sure that you don't have downturns, that will help the poorest quite a lot. So you don't want to have shocks. How do you do that? The answer in the book is work on the governance side. I mean, you can't do that very easily, of course, for recognizing. But if you get that right, how do you work on the governance side? I think there were 3 recommendations at the end of the book, and one was about coalitions. So working with coalitions, and working with, for example, the magicians. And the magicians may not be always where the poorest are. So if you think a bit about sort of, if you want to work your way you want to transform your economy into a different economy, you want to make sure you work with the right coalitions to get you into the direction which is a transformed economy. And doing that, you may need to think about not just targeting only working with the poorest, but also with those that are inclined to think about reforms that help the poorest as well. And so that, of course, is a tricky debate, because we don't want to think about trickle down here. Also want to think about bottom up development, I suppose, in this context as well. But I think there is potentially a trade-off, or working together, that you work with reformers and those that have influence on the reforms to get a transformed economy that can create role-based employment, including for the poorest.
Thank you very much, Dirk. Okay, I think maybe time for one more question, the gentleman here, and then maybe Marta. Marta, you can kind of wrap up a little bit.
Thank you very much. Is that on? Yeah. Thank you very much. That's Stephen Lee from OPM. So I was going to ask Kunal really whether I think he's got a kind of rules deals dichotomy in the book, but I wondered how applied that was to bureaucracies. And I'm asking because, in my experience anyway, if I want to characterize an African bureaucracy, often there's a rule book, but in fact lots of the parameters which dictate what people can do lower down their bureaucracy are sort of they're arranged by a series of personal arrangements, sort of deals, and even if that string of personal relationships goes all the way to the president, those sorts of bureaucracies seem to be quite resilient to things that the president says and policy changes, as they're quite hard to shift. Whereas the story we've just had about the Chinese bureaucracy, I mean, it sounds like a big trick to tell 15 million bureaucrats that they've got quite a lot of freedoms, but within strict parameters. And that sounds like a very rule-based system. And it also sounds very rules-based. If it's possible for the top to make a change which is implemented very quickly, that just sounds like a rule change which is observed. I wondered if you thought about that, Kunal, really, and whether that is a way of working out whether you can reproduce what's done in China in a place where you've got a bureaucracy that works in a very different way.
I mean, again, one has to be careful about the different rules and deals. I mean, Ewing argues in her book that China didn't have a Weberian bureaucracy at the time of the growth acceleration, didn't have professionalism and competency in the way we think of Weberian bureaucracies, but the bureaucrats managed to find ways to experiment and bring about growth. So it's not that, so again, if you look at the Chinese example, it wasn't really about rules-based bureaucrats at that time, that changed, but where bureaucrats were given space to improvise. So in a way, the de facto comes in. But the question then is that in the African context, and I'm just sort of trying to think through how it could apply to your argument, where we have essentially de jure in terms of how the state looks like, and this is the argument Land has made with Matt Andrews and Michael Woolcock, but what we really see are something very different. So this argument is isomorphism. So really then the question is, how can we make states in Africa, which are also not Weberian bureaucracies, behave the way the state did in China in the 1980s, right, when China really started out the growth acceleration, where you had selection of good projects, where you had variation in functional form, in function, where you had different kinds of ways the state improvised with a very de facto system, not a de jure or a rules-based system. So that's, I think, so I suppose the lesson the thing to think through for others who think about other country contexts is, can one think through how that can be replicated in an African context or in a South Asian context. It's not so clear. I mean, I have to say, I was struggling to think about how I could think about in the Indian case, where we also have a very flailing state. So I think those are really interesting questions, which I think we have to think through, that we are not living in a Weberian style world of bureaucrats in the type that we think should be there in the European countries. But then, when you are in a de facto world of how actually things take place in bureaucracies, what's the optimal function of how do we actually devise a mechanism that we saw happen in China in that period in a way that does the job, it does the growth. I don't think I don't have an answer, but I'd be interested. Do you have any thoughts on that? Sorry, then I'll just open your room.
No, go ahead.
I think we're going to have an afternoon seminar where we're going to brainstorm exactly that question you asked. But I think that there's sort of a broader comment I could make about that is that we have to bear in mind that it is a very distinguishing feature that China is a single-party dictatorship. And therefore, in this context, the agents of innovation are the bureaucrats. And when we look at the rest of the developing world, like India, you have a democracy. And so I think when we talk about replicating the China lessons, I think I would be cautious about saying, let's make the Indian bureaucracy like the Chinese bureaucracy. That's just not going to happen because India is a democracy. Even if you had a competent bureaucracy, they will be just constrained by gridlocks, right? Legislative bickering and so forth. And so I think when we think about how do we promote effective adaptation, improvisation in countries like India, we need to put the attention on social actors, on society. But then we need to think about who's going to direct them, who's going to help them provide the incentives, shape the process of improvisation, who's going to play the role of the central leadership, a kind of substitute for the central leadership. And maybe that's how I would think about transferring those lessons, because regime types do matter.
So in each society, you might ask, which are the actors that are most likely to be able to drive growth, and what kind of coalitions are realistically imaginable in this context.
Right.
And in some they may be fairly kind of state-centered, and in others they may be fairly society-centric, and in others it will definitely be a mix. I think that's probably a good time to bring the event to a close. So I'd like to thank our audience online and here in London. And I'd like to thank very much our speakers for coming and contributing to this very stimulating event.